Southeastern Arizona was rough and contested land back then. Folks who dared to roam there called it the Purchase, named after the 1854 Gadsden Purchase that stretched New Mexico territory southward, bringing the Mesilla Valley and land south of Arizona's Gila River down to the 31st parallel. Long before, the Spanish and Mexicans had dubbed the area Apacheria, owing to the Apache tribe's fierce resistance against any settlers. Charles Poston, who later became known as the Father of Arizona, managed to strike a deal with Mangus Coloradus, the mightiest of Apache chiefs, ensuring his miners and lumbermen could work south of Tucson without trouble. Poston even managed to convince Secretary of War Jefferson Davis to send troops for safeguarding his mining operations. By 1856, Poston's Sonora Exploring and Mining Company set up its base at the old Spanish Presidio of Tubac. Not long after, Captain Richard Ewell of the 1st Dragoons, who'd later rise to fame as a Confederate general, established Fort Buchanan on a plateau above Sonoyta Creek just east of Tubac. This lone outpost, built from logs and adobe, offered little in the way of real defense for the settlers but did provide them with a fresh market for cattle and crops. By year's end, with Poston's mining enterprise booming, nearly 1,000 souls had made their home around Tubac. Poston's deal with Mangus Coloradus played a big part in bringing folks back to the Santa Cruz Valley. While Chiricahua Apache raiders often passed by Tubac on their way to stir up trouble down in Sonora, they mostly left the miners, ranchers, lumbermen, and farmers alone. Sure, the land stayed wild and dangerous with outlaws, both American and Mexican, lurking about, but Poston liked to think he'd built a kind of frontier paradise. We had no law except love, and no vocation but work, as he expressed it. No politics, no public debt, no taxes, and no government. It was a community in the most ideal natural state. About 30 miles east of Tubac lay the Sonoyta settlement, home to 7 ranches scattered along the valley floor for a good dozen miles. The 1860 census counted 51 souls in the valley, made up of farmers, teamsters, laborers, a cook, a clerk, a shoemaker, a lawyer, a printer, and one fellow simply labeled as an idiot. Fort Buchanan offered only the faintest hint of protection, with soldiers barely able to safeguard their own horse herd, and Apaches had once made off with several of the officers' tents. Not far from the fort stood the local general store run by White and Granger. 4 miles south of the fort was James Patty Graydon's United States Boundary Hotel, a lively place known to all as Casa Blanca. Just below Graydon's saloon was the ranch of Felix Grundy Ake, who had settled there in 1855 with his fiery family. Next in line was Johnny Ward's ranch at the western bend of Sonoyta Creek, followed by the farms of William Wadsworth, B.C. Marshall, and old Elias Green Pennington. Last but not least was a grist mill run by William Finley and Nathaniel Sharp. The Sonoyta Valley was hailed as a treasure beyond price for the local farmers, according to Tubac's Weekly Arizonian. In due time, a handful of American women made their way into the valley, with the most notable being the daughters of the eccentric Elias Pennington. Known to all in the Purchase as Old Man Pennington, he was a genuine pioneer and a wild, roving soul. He had moved his growing family from Tennessee to Texas back in 1839, but after the passing of his wife, he pressed onward to the west. His journey came to a halt in June 1857 at Fort Buchanan while heading for California, as his daughter Larcena had fallen ill with a fever. While she recovered near the fort, the Apaches made off with several of Elias's oxen. Undeterred, Elias moved his brood of 12 children, 4 boys and 8 girls, to the east bank of the Santa Cruz River, close to the Mexican border, where they dug irrigation ditches and planted crops. They sold their harvest to the soldiers at the fort and the miners at Tubac, and the Apaches left them be. In the eyes of his neighbors, especially the soldiers at the fort, Elias knew that his success as a farmer was often eclipsed by the fine crop of daughters he raised on the homestead. J. Ross Brown wrote, "I had the pleasure of meeting the eccentric old Pennington. He's tall and powerful, with a striking face and a fit physique, making him the best-looking American frontiersman I've ever seen." A book might be written on the story of his life among the Apaches and his lovely daughter's family. In the summer of 1857, Dr. John Hall, a remarkable British soldier of fortune who had spent considerable time in Sonora, arrived in the Santa Cruz Valley. He attended a Christmas gathering at a ranch near the fort, where the Pennington girls made quite a stir. Few American ladies graced the party, but those who did were the belles of the valley, good-looking and true frontier coquettes, as he recalled. Womankind, white, is scarce in Arizona, he noted, so all the young squatters present were quite taken with them. Captain Ewell, whom Hall referred to as an inveterate old bachelor, thoroughly enjoyed the scenery. Hall found himself puzzled by the small stick some American girls had in their mouths. Ewell explained to the well-traveled Englishman that this tobacco-laden stick and the practice of mopping were quite common on the frontier. That little stick was the mop. Dr. Hall felt ashamed. "It's disgusting, far worse than crimin," he cried out. "I can forgive an Irish woman for her short dundeen, a Mexican woman for her smokes, and a Hindu lady for her hookah, but an attractive American girl with a mopstick." Dr. Hall was becoming acutely aware of the social mores that collapsed on the frontier. Many a lonely soldier and miner lost their hearts to 22-year-old Larcena, who stood out as the most beautiful of all the Pennington females. Eventually, on Christmas Eve of 1859 in Tucson, she married the dashing John Page. Page came to Tucson in April 1857 with the infamous shooter Bill Ake, making him one of the wildest spirits in the region. Ake and Page were part of a raucous band of young toughs who would later be labeled cowboys by a subsequent generation. After their wedding, Page whisked his bride away to William Kirkland's Canoa Ranch along the Santa Cruz River. Kirkland was a tall, imposing bachelor of 27 hailing from Virginia, running a successful lumber business that supplied both Tucson and Fort Buchanan. While Page was busy felling timber some 13 miles east in the mountains, Larcena took on the role of tutor for Kirkland's ward, Mercedes Sais Quiroz, a bright 10-year-old daughter of a Mexican widow living in Tucson. Larcena, though, became ill at the Canoa Ranch very quickly. The wetlands by the Santa Cruz River and Sonoita Creek were a breeding ground for mosquitoes that spread malarial fevers, while the dust-laden air carried spores that infected settlers with deadly fevers, which would remain poorly understood for another century, now known as valley fever in Arizona. On March 15, 1860, Larcena and Mercedes, the little girl holding Larcena's tiny puppy in her lap, boarded an ox-drawn supply wagon headed for the logging camp because it was believed that the clean mountain air there would be helpful. Concerned for their safety, Kirkland sent William Randall, a seasoned frontier hand, to ride along on horseback. He also kindly provided a rocking chair and featherbed as gifts for the newlyweds. As the oxen strained to haul the wagon up Madera Canyon toward the lumber camp, 5 Tonto Apaches lay in wait, watching the scene unfold. Though Mangus Coloradas could keep his Chiricahuas in line, he held no sway over the Apache bands roaming north of the Gila River. After an early breakfast, Page and the other woodcutters made their way further up the mountain, while Randall set off to hunt venison for their supper. As Mercedes played nearby, Larcena settled into the rocking chair in her roomy tent, her little dog curled up beside her. When the dog started to growl, Larcena hushed him, only to be startled by Mercedes's scream. Rising to her feet, the tent flap suddenly flew open, and an Apache warrior burst in. Larcena reached for the Colt revolver resting by the featherbed, but the warrior seized her arm and shoved her out of the tent. Mercedes dashed toward Larcena, only to be grabbed by another Apache. Larcena quickly spotted all 5 Apaches clad in nothing but breechcloths and high-topped moccasins, armed with lances, bows, and arrows. They were all young except for an older warrior who spoke broken Spanish. She opened her mouth to scream for help, but a lance pressed against her chest silenced her. The Apaches ripped through the camp looking for valuables. Being on foot, they couldn't carry anything too heavy, so they entertained themselves by slashing open bags of flour in Larcena's featherbed. Feathers and flour swirled through the air like a wild dust storm. Gathering everything they could carry, they marched Mercedes and Larcena up the precipitous hill toward their country in the north. Randall returned at noon to find the camp in shambles and the girls missing. He hurried to alert Page and the other lumbermen. A frantic Page leaped onto Randall's horse and galloped to Canoa. The horse collapsed beneath him as he reached the ranch, breathlessly relaying the news to Kirkland. Kirkland sent a messenger to Fort Buchanan and then rode the 40 miles north to Tucson in search of help. Meanwhile, Paige and another ranch hand saddled fresh horses and set off into the mountains to track down the Apaches' trail. Larcena made sure to mark the rugged trail, breaking twigs and tearing bits from her apron to drop along the way. She asked Mercedes in a whisper to follow suit, but an Apache heard her and tore them apart. The Apache who had taken her revolver aimed it at Larcena's head, mocking her in broken Spanish. Realizing he meant to kill her soon, Mercedes cried out a warning and began to sob. Despite their all being little and wiry, the biggest Apache lifted the young girl onto his shoulders and carried her up the hillside. The climb was steep and tough, and Larcena, weakened by her illness and hindered by her long dress, slowed the Apaches down. As sunset approached, they paused atop a ridge. The view was breathtaking with a steep drop on one side. A warrior who had been acting as a rear guard scrambled up the rocks to inform them that the White Eyes were on their trail. Larcena was directed to remove her clothes by the elder Apache. Another warrior told her to step ahead and demanded her shoes as she plummeted down to her death. Larcena had barely taken a weary step when a lance pierced her back, causing her to tumble sideways down the cliff. She heard the Apaches yelling with joy and Mercedes screaming as she tumbled over the rocks. She came to rest against a small pine tree, nearly unaware of the repeated thrusts from the two Apaches who had slid down beside her. One of the warriors picked up a hefty stone and brought it crashing down on her head. Then everything faded into blessed oblivion. The other Apaches, meanwhile, suppressed the child's agonized cries and raced northeast down the slope. While another warrior put on Larcena's shoes, one fighter took up her clothes. As twilight settled in, Larcena slowly came to her senses. She could hear her little dog barking from the ridgeline above. In the distance, she thought she heard her husband's voice exclaim, "Here it is, boys!" The men were puzzled by the chaotic jumble of tracks along the trail. The dog's barking had led them to stop right above Larcena, but in the fading light they couldn't spot her. Paige had found traces of her shoes further up the ridge and urged the others to press on after the Apaches. Larcena tried to call out, but her strength had ebbed away, leaving her too weak to make a sound. As the voices grew fainter, she slipped back into unconsciousness. Captain Ewell wasted no time in organizing a mounted detachment as soon as Kirkland's message reached Fort Buchanan. Don Antonio Gandera, son of the former governor of Sonora, led a group of 28 Hispanics from Tubac, while the Papagos contributed 17 skilled trackers to the cause. On March 17th, before the first light of dawn, Ewell met up with Kirkland and a civilian posse from Tucson along Cienega Creek, roughly 35 miles southeast of Tucson. They observed that the Apaches had split into two groups and were moving north of the overland mail route. The tracks they followed included bits of clothing that Mercedes had dropped along the way, along with occasional imprints she had left in the soft sand. The other group of Apaches had also been tracked, but there was no sign of Larcena with them. Most folks assumed that the kidnappers belonged to Escaminzon's band of Aravaipa Apaches, who made their home in Aravaipa Canyon as it flowed into the San Pedro River. Held in Fort Buchanan were 20 Pinels who had been taken prisoner after a fight with Ewell's dragoons back in December. The captain pressed several of these men into service as trackers for his column as they made their way north of Tucson into the Catalinas. The trail led straight into the heart of Aravaipa territory. Ewell handed one of the Apache prisoners a dragoon mount and sent him off to Escaminzon's village to initiate talks. Kirkland added 2 fine Mexican blankets to sweeten the deal. Ewell informed the Apache messenger that he would wait for 8 days at Canyon del Oro for a reply, but he cautioned him that any delay in returning the girls would lead to severe consequences for the Pinel prisoners still in their custody. The Apache reappeared a few days later, bearing a message from Escaminzon. He claimed they hadn't taken the captives, but they could negotiate the ransom for the little girl from the Tontos who held her. The woman, however, was dead. In exchange for the girl, Escaminzon demanded the release of the Pinal captives and 2 wagons filled with supplies. A heartbroken Paige carried Ewell's orders south to Kirkland in Tucson, urging him to fetch the Pinal prisoners from the fort and bring them to the dragoon camp. There was no question of hesitating over the Indians' terms, no matter how one-sided they were, Kirkland noted, and immediate efforts were made to fulfill the agreement. In Tucson, folks were sure the Apaches were spinning tall tales. If the Pinels can be trusted, they're the most peaceable Indians around. one local reporter observed. But Captain Ewell held firm in his belief that the Apache tale was true and that the Tontos were the ones at fault. Gathering his prisoners in 2 wagons loaded with goods, Ewell made his way to the main village at the mouth of Surrvivil Canyon. The bank of the San Pedro River was teeming with Indians, as a wary Kirkland noted, "I've never seen so many in my life." Ewell took precautions, lining up his soldiers with their weapons ready as the Apaches drew near. He demanded they send Mercedes to him, while simultaneously ordering his men to let the prisoners out of the wagons. Mercedes dashed past the captain and straight into Kirkland's arms, declaring she was hungry. Ewell wasted no time getting his folks away from Surrvivil Canyon. 2 days later, on April 5th, the column rolled into Tucson. The captain lent Kirkland his fine horse so he could ride alongside Mercedes into the old walled town. Church bells rang out, and the townsfolk gathered in joyful celebration. Kirkland made his way through the bustling crowd to the plaza, where he placed the little girl in her tearful mother's arms. They were quickly surrounded. An eyewitness related how the small girl, who was now a real hero, was embraced by everyone and was given congrats and heartfelt greetings. A grand military ball was held in honor of Ewell and Mercedes, celebrating the captain's knowledge of the Apaches and his wise restraint that had secured the girl's freedom. Ewell was a man who understood when to hold back from a fight. Mercedes blossomed into a delicate and lovely young woman. At 18, she married Charles Chabelle in 1867. Her husband, a former soldier, took on the role of Pima County Sheriff in 1876. Sadly, she passed away at the age of 26 in December 1875 due to complications from the birth of her 4th child. Larcena came to in a snowbank propped against a sturdy pine. She scooped up snow in her hands to drink and tried to wash the wounds that marred her back. She had been stabbed multiple times, but the cuts were beyond her reach. Her head pounded, and her blonde locks were matted with dried blood. How long she had been out cold against that tree, whether a day, 2, or even 3, was a mystery. The sun shone warmly upon her, lending her a bit of strength. She was clad only in her chemise and petticoat. She took her time, gathering her thoughts and assessing her surroundings. Looking west from her precarious position, she spotted Huerfano Butte rising in the Santa Cruz Valley. That cone-shaped hill, a lone sentinel on the arid floor, was the last thing she remembered before the lances struck her. It served as her compass. Larcena knew that Butte sat just northeast of the Canoa Ranch. Too weak to crawl back up the ridge, she carefully slid her way down the mountainside. Every move was pure torment. When she finally reached the flat ground below, she fainted and slept straight through till the next morning. She was awakened by the early sun's warmth. Slowly she pulled herself up, leaning against a tree for support. She didn't dare head down into the valley, knowing it offered no water. The mountains, still shaded by trees, had a few patches of snow left. With Huerfano Butte as her guide, she set out toward Madera Canyon and the lumber camp. Each step was torture as her bare feet struggled over rocks, thorns, and brush. She didn't take long to pass out again. Larcena soon lost all sense of time. The warmth of the sun woke her from those bone-chilling nights, but it scorched her fair skin, leaving it burnt and blistered. She'd melt snow in her hands for a sip of water, nibble on grass and berries, and once stumbled upon some wild onions that lifted her spirits. Her feet were torn up, pebbles working their way into the open wounds, making it impossible to walk. Sometimes she moved on all fours like a wounded critter, but mostly she dragged herself along the ground. She stumbled upon a big nest of dried grass and crawled into its warmth. Just as sleep was about to take her, she realized she'd wandered into a bear's den. She scrambled out and dug herself a shallow hole in the sand to rest. The mountains offered no mercy. She crawled up one steep ridge only to lose her footing and slide all the way back down, ending up even lower than where she'd started. It took her an additional full day to make up the lost distance. The skin on her arms and legs was torn so bad it peeled right down to the bone. She kept pushing on, driven by a grit that no hardship, heartache, or pain could break, no matter what rough nature threw her way. She dragged herself along day after wretched day, curling up into a ragged heap of torn skin, night after bitter night. Then, one fine morning, as the sun warmed her enough to stir, she found herself perched high on a ridge overlooking the road winding into the canyon, heading up to the lumber camp. She caught sight of two fellas driving an ox team along that road. With all the strength she had, she hollered, but they didn't catch wind of her. Desperate, she tore off what was left of her slip, tied it to a stick, and waved it with all she had in her. But before she knew it, they'd moved on, and she had nothing left in her to shed another tear. Larcena reckoned that lumber camp couldn't be far, maybe just a mile or two off, so she kept on crawling. One day turned into another, and before long she found herself right back at the camp where she'd been snatched. The flour and coffee still lay scattered round, feathers from her busted feather bed all mixed up in it. She picked through and managed to scrape up enough flour to make herself some cakes. The men had left a fire still barely burning by the creek, and she coaxed them coals back to life. Crawling to the water, she mixed up a bit of dough and cooked herself some of them cakes. After finishing her meal, she fell asleep. When she stirred awake, she heard the faint but mighty welcome sound of voices and the chop of axes in the distance. Too weak to stand, she dragged herself toward the trail leading up to the pinery at Big Rock. By now, she was near bare, sunburned to a crisp, and nothing but skin and bones held together by sheer will. Up at the main camp lived a fella named Hampton Brown, a black cook from Texas. He'd taken up with his white common-law wife trying to find work out in this far-flung part of the frontier where folks might turn a blind eye to their risky union. Kirkland, he'd often referred to him as that notorious Texas Negro nigger Brown, and his woman they called Virgin Mary. Brown reckoned he was seeing a ghost. Walking down that trail, he caught sight of a figure draped in white, blood-matted hair hanging over her face crawling his way. He hightailed it back to camp, grabbing his gun and brought a few folks along to get a better look at that spooky sight. The figure was able to identify herself as Larcena Page in a whisper. Brown put down his rifle and scooped up the frail woman in them powerful arms of his. He carried her to camp where the Virgin Mary gently washed her, pulled the rocks from her feet and the thorns from her skin, cleaned her festering wounds and got her something to eat. After that, she dressed Larcena in fresh clothes. Larcena asked for a bit of tobacco and then drifted off to sleep. It had been a hard 15 days since the Apaches took her. Tom Childs, one of them woodcutters, tore out of there and rode hard to Kanoa with the news. Kirkland was there getting ready to escort the last bunch of Pinel prisoners over to Ewell at Surrvivil Canyon. He gave Childs a fresh mount and sent him on his way to Tucson to fetch Larcena's worried husband. Though the Apaches claimed his wife was dead, Page had never given up hope. Now, with a fire lit under him, he was riding south to Kanoa alongside Childs, Tucson's Dr. C.B. Hughes, and Ed Radcliffe from Tubac. They rode through the night, arriving at the ranch just as Kirkland was setting off. Pushing on that last dozen miles to the lumber camp, they were staggered by what they saw. "Never seen the like," Radcliffe said. "Skin and bones, hands, knees, arms, raw as meat. From crawling over them cruel rocks up and down those hills." Dr. Hughes told Page he had no chance saving her. Page wasn't hearing none of that. He found himself a wagon and laid his wife in it as gentle as he could. Him and the doc guided the team down that rough mountain trail through Madera Canyon, then headed north on the rutted road to Tucson. Page was set on having her under the doc's watchful eye the whole way. Larcena hung on, teetering between life and death for some long, grueling weeks, but then started to make a downright miraculous turn. When Radcliffe laid eyes on her later that summer, he couldn't help but marvel at the woman standing before him, saying she was a sight to behold. The wounds she'd carried began to mend, leaving only scars on the outside, while the inside ones took their own time to fade. Come summer, Page took his missus back to the cabin he'd built near the mouth of Madera Canyon, about 10 miles out from Kirkland's Kanoa Ranch. It was there they reckoned on starting fresh. But fate, it seemed, wasn't ready to grant 'em peace for long. Come January 27, 1861, them Aravaipa raiders came down on Johnny Ward's ranch over in the Sonoita Valley, snatching up his stepson Felix, just 11 years old. By then, Captain Ewell had headed back east, and all that was left was a greenhorn lieutenant to chase after the Apaches. He made his way to Apache Pass, where he had words with Chiricahua Chief Cochise about the boy. Cochise swore he wasn't mixed up in it, but that young officer took some of Cochise's folks hostage anyway. Cochise slipped away, and when them hostages got strung up, the chief lit the fire for a vengeful war. In just 60 days after that trouble at Apache Pass, Cochise's warriors were everywhere, striking at 5 stage stations, ambushing mail coaches, and sweeping through the Santa Cruz Valley, leaving 150 of the hated White Eyes dead in their wake, including Poston's brother. One of the early victims in that bloody affair was Larcena's own husband. Page and 2 other guys from the sawmill, Alf Scott and Jim Cotton, had been recruited by Wadsworth to accompany a supply wagon he required to Fort Breckenridge. A heavy snowfall that January put a halt to work up at the pinery, so Page saw it as a fine chance to make some extra cash. Lord knew he needed it with Larcena expecting their first child. He bid his pregnant wife a somber farewell at their cozy cabin at the mouth of Madera Canyon, promising he'd be back before long. Page and his crew were making their way about 30 miles north of Tucson on February 20th. They had a couple of Mexican fellas and a gal riding in the wagon, while the 3 of them rode ahead scouting the trail. As they paused to water their horses by a dry wash in the Catalina Mountains, them Apaches came down on 'em fierce. Cotton looked back just in time to see his pals slumping over their saddles, horses still running. The sudden gunfire sent the oxen into a panic, and they jerked the wagon clean off the road, tumbling it down into a steep gulch. As them Apaches swarmed around, eager to take the loot and oxen, Cotton and the other 3 riders made a break for Tucson. They rode hard, reaching town by midday next. Now Charles Brown, the saloon keeper who ran the best joint in Tucson, tried rounding up a posse to head out and lend a hand, but folks were rattled by the news from Apache Pass. Took William S. Oury, who'd just come back from Apache country himself, to rustle up 3 good men to join him. With Cotton leading the way, they rode back toward that canyon. Come dawn, the call of scavenger birds pointed the way. They found Page's lifeless form sprawled out in a mesquite thicket, a good ways from the wagon. His horse lay there too, throat slit, alongside his body. Nearby were Scott's saddle, pistol, and blanket. Them 2 wounded men must have fought tooth and nail against them Apaches for at least a full day, before Scott tried to set out for help. They'd even put down the horse just to drink its blood and keep themselves going. Page was laid to rest right there in that forsaken spot. About 2 weeks later, another bunch stumbled upon Scott's body, what was left of it anyhow. Oury took what he could salvage, Page's kerchief, pocketbook, and a lock of hair, reckoning Larcena'd want something to remember him by. Elias took his daughter Larcena to the sturdy stone house on his ranch by the Santa Cruz, letting her sisters care for her. Come September, Larcena gave birth to a daughter she named Mary. As time passed, her father and 2 of her brothers were abducted by the Apaches when they returned. A woman of strong faith, Larcena faced all her hardships with dignity, often whispering to herself, "God is good and knows best. God is good and knows best."